Welcome everybody. My name is Ferdinando from the University of Bern. And interestingly enough, at the University of Bern, I'm doing my PhD, but I will talk to you about what I did at my master's still at the University of Bern some time ago. So it's quite nice for me to present again what I did some time ago. So if we go in an alpine environment and we do a sketch of a section of an alpine slope, we know that the stability of such slope is mainly ruled by a complex interaction between pre-existing discontinuities that could be faults or shear zones and intact portion of the rocks that are called rock bridges. And as soon as these intact rock bridges fail, then the entire rock slope fails, and then we have a rockfall event. Within these kind of natural discontinuities, we have all the sort of weathering process active. And among all these sort of weathering processes, we also have the frost wedging process. How does it work, this process? So if we think and we zoom in into one of these discontinuities and we fill these fractures or faults, whatever it is, with water, and then we drop the temperature to negative values, the water simply becomes ice, has a volumetric expansion of about 9% in volume. That generates a pressure, a cryostat pressure that increases the stress at the tip of the fracture. And if the stress is enough, it overcomes the rock strength, and then it leads to crack propagation. If this crack propagation is well directed and breaks the intact rock bridges, then we have a rockfall event. So this process of frost wedging is believed to be a very crucial one and very hazardous one. So in this study, we decided to try to investigate and try to understand how does this process work and exploit our rock weaknesses in this kind of setting. So at the tip of these fractures, and try to propagate and simulate how does that work. So we followed an experimental approach where we first of all tried to design a setup where we could really try to prove and see how this process works. So investigating the mechanism on its own, and then try to understand how the rock properties influence really the breaking and the process of the frost wedging itself. So how did we do that? So we went in the field, we collected gneiss samples from a massif in the Central Alps in Switzerland. We drilled cylinders of about 2.5 centimeters and 5 centimeters in height alongside the foliation of the gneiss. And inside of the sample, we created an artificial fracture that was more or less till half of the sample. And we did that by gently loading a wedge, a piston wedge on top of the sample that you can see triggered and created an artificial fracture. Very important for us was to create an artificial fracture that simulated entirely natural taper shaped fractures, and not only cutting the sample with a saw that doesn't really simulate the roughnesses and complex features that are present in natural fractures. Then we filled the fractures with water. We sealed the sides of the fracture with silicone rubber and also on top. And then we placed for the testing a water column on top of it to avoid evaporational issues during then the testing. We placed our sample inside of an environmental chamber where we performed freeze-thaw cycles from -20 to +20 degrees in temperature. So in the presentation of today, we will look at two series of tests, the first one and the second one, where in all of the series of experiments, we perform 3D X-ray computed tomography before and after the testing so that we could characterize and quantify the volume of the fracture before and after the testing in order to understand if the testing, first of all, was effective, but also on how much our testing impacted and the fracture that we had in the sample. The resolution of the CT was about 15 voxel in resolution. In the first series of testing, we then, at the end of the test, when everything was over, we filled the fracture with epoxy resin, and then we did some thin sections, and we did some optical microscopy in order to understand a bit more at the thin sections and with the microscopy how the process of propagation worked within the rocks and our samples. Whereas in the second series of testing, we recording during the testing with the displacement sensor how the aperture and closure of the fracture during the testing. The extensometer was placed at the side of the sample in a custom-made sample holder. So in the next sequence of slides, we will go through the results of the first series and the second series, and then we combine together all the observation in a couple of discussion slides that maybe can trigger a bit of discussion, let's see. Yeah, it might be interesting. So the first series of experiments aimed and target mainly to show that this process is active and that we could reproduce it. So we performed 87 freeze-thaw cycles between -20 and +20 degrees of about a frequency of 4 cycles a day. And we were able to prove that we could propagate the fracture under frost wedging conditions. So in this image here, you see that we have two volumes of the fracture overlapped. So in red, the original fracture, so the artificially induced fracture. And in blue, placed on top of it, the volume of the fracture propagated, so that we had at the end of the testing. And as you can see at the bottom part of the fracture, we originally had in the artificial fracture two branches of it. And while propagating after the testing, then these two branches got merged into one single fracture surface that then propagated deeper section of the sample of about 3.5 square centimeters. So it was quite interesting for us. We could really image the propagation of the fracture. The second series of experiment, as I told you before, was also recorded by an extensometer that was placed at the side of the sample. And this is the displacement record that we had during the testing. So it was a test of about 30 days, like a month. And and this is the displacement curve that we got out of the extensometer. So you see a lot of up and downs and wiggling, and these up and downs are related to the changes in temperature in our environmental chamber. And interestingly is that at -20 degrees, we recorded an expansion of our sample, of our cylinder, whereas at +20 degrees, a contraction. And why is that? It's because the water at -20 degrees becomes, so at negative temperature, starting from -2, -1, becomes ice, increase the volume, and therefore makes recording to the extensometer an expansion. Whereas then at +20, everything closed down again, and we record a contraction. We also performed the CT analysis before and after the testing. And here, since the sample was still sealed by the silicone rubber, we discovered that actually during the testing, we broke the sample. So the fracture tip reached the bottom of the sample here in light blue. And therefore, we interpreted the curve at the point of maximum displacement, that is the convention when people analyze then the extensometer records, the failure occurred at this point. If we then put an interpretation on the displacement curve, we can see that, first of all, after the failure, everything is negligible because the two inert sides hinges of the sample were broken, and therefore making movements that create a kind of a noise at the end of it. But the curve that brought us to the failure in the samples had a very interesting shape. So we have a sequence of steps in which we had stages of fast propagation and stages of halt in fracture propagation. And this got repeated 3 times till then we reached sample failure. Why do we have this sort of propagation of the fracture that runs and then stops again and then once more? We related this pattern in fracture propagation to the property of the rock itself. And then we went to look directly to the thin sections data that we got from the other series of tests, where we really cut through the samples. We imaged the fracture that we had with that was epoxy resin that had a UV light reactant in there, so we could really image the fracture. And then we went to look in the propagated sections of the fracture where actually the fracture got and went through. And we could see and prove that actually the fracture went really through the weaknesses inside of our rock sample. So preferentially the cleavage of preferentially oriented biotite grains, for example, ultrafine polymineralic aggregates, it run through that very easily, and alongside grain boundaries, for example. And we related the propagation of this fracture to fast events. So because the fracture really runs very quickly and easily in there, it doesn't really need a lot of strength to propagate through them. Whereas as soon as the fracture encountered feldspar porphyroclast, for example, or larger quartz grains, for example, the stress to be accumulated at the fracture tip before it could overcome and jump to the next weakest was a bit larger, and therefore probably the fracture in these kind of zones had to halt, and then when enough stress was accumulated, then jump to the next weaknesses. But actually the most interesting feature that we found by looking at the thin sections and tomography data while looking at what we had was actually the presence of grains that were stuck between the walls of the fracture. And these were grains of feldspar, quartz, or portion of the rock itself. And we have proven by looking at the tomography data that these grains actually migrated during the testing from upper part of the fracture to way deeper part of the fracture. And we tried to better understand this migration of the grains, and also try to understand the effect that the migration might have over increasing the stress at the fracture tip, or actually propagating the fracture itself. So we named these grains as a wedging grain, and I prepared for you in the next slide like a tiny interpretation on how this migration of the grain really works during the testing and during the frost wedging process itself. So we have two sketches in here that will move in time. So we have a taper-shaped fracture that is filled with water, and actually we are at the lowest part of it. So the fracture continues upward here in the slide. We have a wedging grain that is stuck between the walls of the fracture, and below we have our displacement curve recorded by the extensometer during our testing. We start at +20, so everything is water, and as soon as we freeze, we have seen it before, we have learned before that we record an expansion of the fracture itself induced by the ice, and the grain gets detached from the walls. It just starts to be stays simply there. While then starting the cooling part of our curve at about +4 degrees, the melting of the ice starts from the sides of the fracture where the worms actually come from, and then propagates and then melts in the core of the fracture. So in the central portion of the fracture, we have a metastable wedge of ice that actually migrates from the deeper portion of the fracture where we have simply less water, so it melts less ice, so it melts faster, to the central core of the fracture. And while migrating this melting ice fringe, it eventually reaches our wedge grain that is still detached from the wall, and it releases it and let it fall to a deeper portion of the fracture. When we then complete our cooling, warming up, so we reach again +20 degrees, the grain is at a deeper section of the fracture, and it impedes a complete closure and recovery of the closure of the fracture, so creating an effect and creating a permanent aperture in the fracture. If you repeat this again and again, you can see that this effect by migrating this grain from an upper section to a lower section gets larger and larger. Of course, a single tiny grain or a single grain of feldspar or quartz is not that important, but as we can have seen, and also as you can imagine, a large amount of these kind of grains that moves to deeper section of the fracture might actually be relevant in increasing the stress at the fracture tip. So if I quickly sum up what I just told you before, you have learned that ice-driven mechanical weathering or frost wedging is a very important and crucial factor, especially nowadays in this crazy weather that we have in the Alps, and a very hazardous process because it exploits fractures and it triggers rock slopes events, so rock falls. The fracture propagation, as many of the weathering process, exploits the weaknesses of the rock, and you have learned which are them from the micro scale as well. And we have other processes that might cooperate together with the frost wedging itself, and that might be slightly strongly connected to such process that is this, for example, wedging grain, that might really help into propagating the fracture and breaking our intact rock bridges. Another thing is that might be very interesting to conclude is that, sure, we have seen these grains at the micro scale, so very, very tiny, but it's easy to expand the scale of these blocks or grains. So if you think about a fracture of about 20 or 50 centimeters scale, and you think about a block moving down into them that we have on alpine slopes, then you can see and immediately understand the effect that they might have into propagating our fracture. Thank you very much.